All right, folks, let's continue the conference with the final panel of today, which is a panel about quantum governance, intellectual property, fair competition, and geopolitical dynamics. And the panel will be moderated by Professor Mark Lemley from Stanford Law School.
Great. All right. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for sticking it out through a pretty remarkable day with a bunch of different topics. So we have a pretty open-ended agenda for this panel. We are, among other things, to talk about antitrust and IP and standards, but some of those things we have already talked about. So we're also going to talk about geopolitics, and privacy and a bunch of other things. So we have an outstanding set of panelists. We're going to hear from Chris Hoofnagel, who's a professor at Berkeley, Tina Decker, who is a nanotech and IP lawyer in Canada, Chris Demchek from the Naval War College, and Aubrey Davis from the U.S. Air Force Academy. And I think each of them are going to say a few words in short presentations, and then we've got a bunch of topics we want to talk about as a panel and discussion. So Chris Hoofnagel.
Great. Thank you, Professor Lemley. And let me, before I start with my short talk, I just want to thank everyone here at Stanford, in particular Professor Kopp, for such a lovely event. There are so many small details about this event that make it special. And one of the things that I only realized today is to see a conference moderator so enjoying himself. And that itself is a special skill, and I admire it deeply. And I also admire being done here at Stanford. Your dean, Dean Martinez, is a real force for good. And if anybody is worried about the state of free speech on campus, check out her letter to the Stanford faculty and community about free speech. It's really, I think, a classic piece. I'm going to talk about quantum sensing, and so my talk will largely follow a talk that was given earlier today by Edward Chow. I've written a book about quantum technologies. It's called Law and Policy for the Quantum Age. Don't buy it because it is available open access. You can download the whole book free from Cambridge University Press. And if you look at it, you'll see that it contains a layperson's introduction to quantum technologies. But then chapter 2 is all about quantum sensing. So we start with sensing. Well, why is that? Quantum sensing is the oldest and most mature form of quantum technologies. If you've ever had an MRI, you in fact have been measured by a quantum sensor. It works by detecting the magnetic spin of individual hydrogen atoms inside your body. What is quantum sensing? Well, quantum sensing are a class of devices that use the smallest amount of energy and matter to detect tiny changes in time, gravity, temperature, pressure, rotation, acceleration, frequency, and magnetic fields and electric fields. And I had to write this out because there's so many different areas, I can't remember them all. But it's a very broad class of sensing that are important. And so here, I have one slide. And it's perfectly timed because it's now going to become clear why this matters. When most people talk about the intelligence community, they talk about signals intelligence. That's really what's dominated the headlines in recent years surrounding the different leaks and the different capabilities and cyber and so on. What quantum sensing is going to enable is a revolution in a different type of intelligence, what's known as MASENT, or measurement and measurement and signature intelligence. And it's ultimately, I think, is going to become more important than signals intelligence. MASENT methods have proliferated. There are a fantastic number of different approaches to use measurement from the air, from space, from the ground to figure out what an adversary is doing. Quite subtle techniques, and they can align to help states understand what's happening. So what is the exciting machine learning that's currently happening in defense applications? These are ones where multiple inputs, multiple sensing inputs are being integrated to help soldiers decide what is happening in the world. And so this is actually good news, in my opinion, for things like human rights, because you get a more accurate picture of the situation. Another reason why quantum sensing matters is that it's a precursor for quantum computing. Quantum computers are essentially quantum sensing ensembles, is one way to think about a quantum computer. So investment in quantum computing is likely to have knock-on effects for quantum sensing. There's also the issue of resolution. One of the reasons why quantum sensing is important is it's not just more resolution. New capabilities come from resolution, from higher resolution. So I want to emphasize that on one hand, there's new capabilities, and that's usually what people want to talk about, what's new. But the other not so obvious point is that more and more resolution gives you new capabilities, and sometimes they're quite surprising. So for instance, advances in PNT, so that's positioning, navigation, and timing, can make contributions to other forms of sensing. With more precise timing, measurements can be combined in ways, for instance, to create super resolution. So let me explain a few reasons why this really matters. GPS, so Global Positioning Systems, is a PNT technology. The US has the original GPS constellation in space. It costs the equivalent of $14 billion. The taxpayer paid for that, okay? That didn't just come out of nowhere. You and I paid for that. Here's the problem with it. It's very easily blocked. So the way the GPS signal works is it actually doesn't even know that you're receiving it. It gets sent down from space to Earth, and a receiver catches the signal. Quite easy to jam this. In fact, you can go online and buy a GPS jammer for about $20, and it'll plug into your cigarette lighter. Why is that? It's because long-haul truckers like to block GPS. And so they can create a local GPS exclusion zone. Well, so can our adversaries, like the Russians. They can create very large GPS exclusion zones. So why is this relative to quantum? Quantum PNT technologies can essentially replace GPS and operate in denied environments. They can operate underwater, underground. So you can imagine all sorts of really interesting applications. There's some other implications here. I'll quickly wrap them up because I think I'm running out of time. The capability of seeing through walls and seeing through other barriers. As you can sense, you can't shield gravity. So if you can sense gravity with a high resolution, you can start to figure out what's behind things, what's behind this concrete shield and so on. And that could be very important for nation states. And so maybe this is the point for me to talk about my slide here, a couple different applications. This picture of the helicopter towing a sensor, that's a quantum sensor. This is actually a Chinese study where using this quantum sensor suspended from a helicopter, so just think about all the noise and vibration and craziness going on there. They're able to detect iron balls that are buried underground. So that's really exciting, right? Landmine detection seems really obvious and very pro-social use of quantum technologies. But then you could just think about the submarine. If you can detect the iron balls underground, why not use similar techniques to detect very large metal objects in the ocean, right? And then you could see an application of the technology that could be quite strategically significant. A couple other things, a couple other not so obvious implications of this include the idea of detecting whether or not something is a decoy. It could be super important. And let me just make one final point. A lot of quantum sensing, not all quantum sensing, but a lot of quantum sensing is stealthy. So the idea that you can sense, the idea that you're sensing tells an adversary something. But if you can sense with stealth, that becomes really interesting. And that's where rigs like quantum radar become very exciting. That's what this upper left-hand image is. The idea that you could use photonic detection to see a low observable, like a stealth jet. On one hand, that's a great capability. On the other hand, it can be done with stealth, so the adversary does not know they're sensed, which creates very interesting knock-on game theoretical problems. So I'll stop there and just say, I'll give one more pitch for my book. It's free, don't buy it.
All right, Tina.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to our conference organizers for what's been an amazing conference so far. Thank you all for attending, and of course, thank you to Mr. Lemley for moderating this panel. I'm actually going to start with a land acknowledgement. So I live and work in Ottawa, Ontario, and Ottawa is situated on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. And we are all visitors to Stanford today, and Stanford is situated on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and this land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. So the topic of this panel has a lot of overlap with a paper that I recently co-authored with Professor Florian Martin-Berthaud from the University of Ottawa. It's entitled Regulating Uncertain States, a Risk-Based Policy Agenda for Quantum Technologies. And in this paper, we propose a functional risk-based approach. So what this means is we argue for regulating the use and applications of quantum technologies rather than trying to regulate the quantum technology itself. So as an example, we want to avoid conversations where we're asking whether we should ban quantum computing, which maybe sounds far-fetched, but if we think about the dialogue we've been hearing in AI recently, maybe it's not so far-fetched that people might start talking that way. Instead, we can look to specific uses and applications. So an example I might give is maybe quantum computing methods as applied to machine learning, used for automated decision-making. And we would actually go a step further and ask, well, what is the automated decision, like who's using it, who's being impacted by it? And so we actually have to drill down to what the use or application is. The functional risk-based approach also calls for agile regulation, and we heard a little bit about this earlier today. So this idea that the regulatory frameworks that we use for applications and uses of quantum technology need to be adaptable. They need to adapt to the different risks and benefits that quantum technologies and their applications bring, and that's going to change as we learn more about the technology and also as the different applications and uses mature. And so, I mean, we've heard a bit about what risk assessments might look like. We've heard about governance models, and in our paper, we take this one step further and we situate some known quantum technologies, uses, applications, predicted uses, applications. We situate it in the Canadian legal context. So I'm from Canada, as you obviously heard, and so this was relevant to us. And when we examine the uses and applications of quantum technologies through a legal lens, what we'll find is that in many cases, we already have regulatory frameworks that we can use to address the concerns we might have about the harms that quantum technologies might bring. So using the example from earlier, this idea of quantum-powered automated decision-making, I don't know if that's a thing, but it sounds like it might be a thing. I'm just going to be honest there. So we would probably situate that in our existing regulatory frameworks for AI and automated decision-making. You know, we don't necessarily need a law of the horse, to quote Lessig. We already have some frameworks that we can use. Now, the question of whether those frameworks for AI and automated decision-making, whether those are adequate to address those needs, I mean, that's a different question that's not really tied to the question of what quantum technologies are doing in that space. But of course, we are going to have some situations where, you know, quantum is different. It is going to make us ask questions where, you know, if our regulatory frameworks are not sufficient, you know, what needs to change? How can we adapt them? Do we need a new regulatory framework, new legislation standards? We're already seeing some of this in spaces like cybersecurity, for example, and the encryption frameworks. In that case, as we've heard today from many people, we can draw on so many different other industries and technologies to get inspiration about how we might address quantum technologies. And the reason for this is that the applications and uses of quantum technologies are very broad. You know, it's not just quantum computing, it's not just sensing, it's not just communication and networks. I mean, it's all of these things, and sometimes these technologies are interleaved together for specific uses and applications. And so an example that I guess I had in terms of where we might have maybe a new regulatory framework, or maybe not even that, where we need to ask the questions, you know, is this enough, would be in market competition. This is an area that I have a personal interest in. And so we might take the example of quantum computing, can say, okay, quantum computing, if we look at that in the context of market competition, well, fair market competition is regulated by antitrust law and natural market forces. We might say, well, quantum computing isn't so different from regular computing. So when we examine a market in the computing, so if we're examining fair market competition, for example, we have to define the market. In the computing market, we would first separate it. Well, are we looking at hardware? Are we looking at software? And we might break that down further to see, who are the main players in this particular application or use. And so we say, okay, maybe quantum computing can kind of fit into our framework for regular computing in terms of how we examine whether there's fair market competition. But then maybe it's not. So a thought that I had is, well, we have these different qubit technologies, and we know that different qubit technologies have different advantages and disadvantages. Some are better at solving certain types of problems versus others. And so maybe that changes how we define our market when we're assessing who are the major players and is there fair market competition in terms of like what are the barriers to entry, who can enter, who has the most power. And so if we realize that our market is shrinking, then we might think, well, maybe we do need some sort of regulation or some sort of changes to our existing antitrust framework, for example, to make sure that we are having fair market competition, to ensure that smaller companies can enter the quantum computing market, the example I'm working with, without sort of being overshadowed by the larger players who have their own role, of course, in the industry. So one idea I had is maybe we can analogize to the Digital Markets Act. So that's regulating social media. And in the Digital Markets Act in Europe, we have the idea of a gatekeeper. And the idea is that the players with greater market power have corresponding greater responsibilities and obligations tied to that market power in a particular industry. And so maybe there's an opportunity to do something like that in quantum computing. I don't know. It's an idea. And so in the interest of time, I'll sort of wrap things up. And I guess if there's one thing that I would want you to take away from what I've said is that we really do need to look at the uses and applications of quantum technology. We've heard a little bit about some of the broader values and principles that we need in terms of responsible development of quantum technology. And all of that's very important. And we have to start there in terms of setting a global baseline for what responsible quantum technology should look like. But when it comes to a practical application, what is the regulatory framework? What are the laws that we want to apply, or standards, or other, regulatory tools? We have to look at the specific quantum technology or quantum technologies, the application and the uses, what it's being used for, who's being impacted by it, who's using it, and so you need to really drill down on what it's being used for. And so, yeah, that's what I'd like to say for now. And thank you.
Great. Chris?
So I spent a day with a lovely page of talks, of points that I've been crossing out during the day, going, right, that one's done.
It's
okay.
bad to go last.
I know, and it's the end of the day. So I'm just going to give you the guts of what's left on this page, and then maybe added to. So first of all, I have to tell you that my background is from the other university on the other side of the bay, and in which I did large-scale socio-technical, and I now say economic systems, and surprise. And so I drifted, as graduate students are wont to do, into asking the question, what happens when you combine complex technologies with complex organizations and societies, and nasty things happen? What then happens? What's the next thing? And that led me, as one would, naturally, to cybersecurity. And so I've been doing that for some years. And now I'm spending some time looking at socio-technical economic systems in terms of cyber's offspring, including AI, quantum, nano, and everything else that interests me technically. So the couple of things that I want to point out is I spend a lot of time thinking about the dependencies between these technologies and where they can be manipulated or where they can be irresponsibly applied. And in that regard, I want to make just three, well, I guess it turns out 4 points. One of them, I spend a lot of time looking at what I call silo similarities, and that's the literature that discusses AI, and then it discusses quantum, and then it discusses cyber. And I want to throw in nano because only 2 people have mentioned it, and I think we should remember this. That we have to remember that the quantum that we're developing, when you apply it, when it gets out of the lab, these the quantum information services are going to be embedded in these other technologies. And so one of the questions that we have to try and ask ourselves is, when that happens, does that make a significant difference in terms of the questions we care about? Are they simply, as someone said, rhyming or similar? Are they actually different? So, you know, getting out of the silos, but I think this conference is actually wonderfully exemplar of how we could do that. The second point is agency. I just spent a year as the Department of Navy's representative to the Deputy Secretary of Defense's Responsible AI Working Group. And we discussed extensively the development of the AI cycle. And, you know, how soon do you intervene to insert a sense of responsible development? So one of the things that I would urge people to do as we think about quantum, when we talk about making it responsible, is ask the question, you know, make sure our recommendations have some sort of agency in them, if they matter. Not just it's a really great idea, let's be persuaded how wonderful it is. And I will tell you, a major hurdle is the one we already know from cyber and we already know from AI, is we don't have metrics. We've talked about risk base, we've talked about these things, but we don't even have good metrics on AI and cyber, which are the, you know, cyber in particular, the underpinning of how we're going to implement quantum. The third thing I want to talk about is, a point I want to make is that responsible quantum is really about preparing for a post-quantum breakout world. When we think it's distributed widely, it's not simply held by monopoly actors and distributed as their want through the cloud. So we have to think about, in those terms, you know, what does that mean? Are we already in part of this post-quantum world? I mean, do we already have some of it there, and so we can learn from those experiences? Or do we really have to go back and start simulating and understanding it better? And the final one is one rather close to my heart, and probably to others, is where is the collective imperative in this, in terms of generative development, in terms of socio-technical economic systems contributions, and finally, of course, in terms of security and resilience. So we are moving into an extraordinarily divided world. It's very hard to relate what we face today as consolidated democracies with what we faced 20, 30 years ago. And in that world, I think it was Dr. Cohen had asked about whether we're going to be asymmetric or symmetric in this future. I will argue, and you can ask me about this, I don't see a path to symmetric distribution of these resources. Therefore, it's going to be asymmetric. And under those circumstances, we have to spend time about discussing agency, because we're going to really need it as democracies. Thank you.
And Aubrey.
So good afternoon, everybody. Aubrey Davis from the United States Air Force Academy, and I was especially moved by how we have come together here today. My mother was an opera singer, and so I always commented to my mother when I was young about opera is unique in the sense that a whole bunch of people can talk at the same time, but everybody can understand what they say. And so, Maritz, thank you very much for bringing the thematics to this conference in that way, because in many respects, quantum is that device. It is that way that we can conceptualize things on multiple levels simultaneously. And I think we're doing it right now by all coming together and talking about these subjects. So thank you, Maritz, and thank you also for the organizers as well. I also had a very long list of things that I would like to have covered, and people have gotten to them in beautiful fashion, I might add. I mean, it's like, wow, I want to write these down because I would like to cover them in my classes in much the same way as has been discussed. One of the things that did come up from a thematic perspective was, how do we regulate, or how do we conceptualize the problem in terms of risk? The military looks at risk in many, many different ways, but we operationalize risk every single day. anytime that we put somebody into harm's way, we do a risk calculation. And we actually have an instruction. We actually, as most of the military wants to do, we always put things in books and regulations and things like that. And we have the Department of the Air Force Instruction 90-802 that has a risk management methodology for operational risk assessment. And I propose that to the room in a way of looking at it from the perspective of, we have had a lot of discussion that looks at risk from sort of the inception, like, okay, what do we believe the technology might do? But is it also worth asking the question of what happens when the user is sitting at the terminal or sitting there and developing the technology? Is there a way that we can conceptualize risk at the user level to look at it that way? And so in our instruction, we look at it from the perspective of sort of two axes. On the one hand, we have sort of this idea of the amount of loss that might occur. So you have catastrophic all the way down to negligible or negligent loss. And by catastrophic, we're talking about the loss of life or loss of mission or loss of people or equipment, things like that, all of which are very, very important. And then on the other axis, you've got sort of the frequency over time. The predictability is impossible to do, but I think everybody innately can look at a technology or an application of a technology and say, you know what? This might have some far-reaching consequences. And by extrapolating that data, we can look at it from the perspective of, well, shoot, if we take off today and there's thunderstorms in the area, then there's probably a pretty high risk that something bad is going to happen. And so we can sort of look at that from a common sense perspective and perhaps adopt that methodology for the user on at that end of the spectrum. So I put that out there as a thought and an idea, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. Another theme that I've enjoyed about today, especially, is the idea of cooperation, both within industry, within the university system, obviously to which I'm a part of now, but also within government. And Chris, in your book, which is wonderful, by the way, I would recommend everybody to read it. He talks about it in terms of, government funding and how that has created innovation. But I think that many people, when they hear government funding, are like, oh, geez, there's going to be strings attached. I'm going to have to share all of my proprietary technology and things like that. So there becomes some level of disincentivization that happens there. And I was interested, while I was working especially at Air Combat Command, to learn about things that are vehicles such as CRADA, so Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, and other types of tech transfer vehicles, patent licensing agreements and things like that, that we do in the military to a very little extent. I mean, I was surprised at the number of attorneys in the Air Force JAG Corps who had never even heard of it, who had not even understood what documents to reference, that there's a federal law that controls it. And so I put that out there for first of all, for people's information, but when you look at sort of the command structure for the Air Force Research Lab, I know IBM works closely with the Air Force Research Lab and other entities, we do have a lot of tech transfer information and pieces of information for the purposes of building and spinning out technology that we create in the government to put it out, put it outside of the government. So it's very intentional, and I think that we have ways of doing that in the quantum space that are going to be helpful in many instances. The last point that I wanted to make is what can we learn from other areas of the law? One of the things that has been a thematic all day is the idea of cooperation, but also communication. If I'm to take the Outer Space Treaty, Article 9, as an example of what that could mean or what that could look like, one of the main things that people want to avoid is the Kessler event. Like we want to avoid Kessler. We don't want satellites crashing into each other and creating an environment in low Earth orbit that is going to become untenable or unusable. Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty really has within it built-in apparatuses to say, hey, look, let's do things like frequency deconflict. Let's make sure that we're not walking over, our GPS system to make it so that it's ineffective. It's something that's useful for everybody. But at the same time, is there a way that we can do that and build that into or bake it into our systems now for cooperation and mutual assistance, and especially the requirement under Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty for consultation, like a duty to consult. Can we think that, and can we ask that question now, where I say, hey, look, we're developing this technology, let's talk. Let's talk maybe in a way that is mutually beneficial for us, but also in a way that protects our interests at the same time. So those are the three things that came to my mind that are remaining on my list. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mark. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. So we've got a bunch of questions I want to talk about, and the first several have to do with this theme of cooperation, right, but also in the context of some of the sort of military applications and potential risk structures. Is this, I mean, Chris Hufnagel, right, as you talk about sort of some of these technologies, are these technologies we want to prevent from export, right? Is this can we keep this from China? Do we want to keep this from China? Or is this something where we want international cooperation and as we heard from the last speaker, sort of building out to the developing world?
This is the first question I get from government officials, is how can we export control various quantum technologies? And I think the answer to that is very difficult. I think the way to think about it is, can a nation identify places where they have asymmetric advantage and then use export control to shape the strategic landscape? But the problem is it's hard to identify where those advantages are. Many of the core components for these technologies are commercially available. And so as I was listening to Chris speak about the breakout, are we in a breakout moment? Well, if you look at the leading quantum computer, Professor Pons in China, if you look at it, he's released a pretty high resolution image of it. You'll see that it's made of American parts. It's made of Thorlab. Anyone in physics would recognize Thorlab. It's a whole series of Thorlab devices that are built into an interferometer. So that little fact is really interesting, and it makes me wonder whether an export control strategy can work. Let me just quickly mention two things that, if we're going to do export control, we should also be thinking about industrial policy. We should have tripwires to make sure that when our export controls become more burdensome than helpful, we get rid of them real quick. And I also think we should be talking about immigration. And I think we found some agreement on this. I mean, I know it would lead to abuse, and it might be, it's a daring idea, but I think we ought to be stapling green cards to people who graduate from institutions like Stanford and Berkeley with certain degrees. And it just should happen automatically because we're actually training. Many of the best experts in the world are training here and then leaving. And why not hold on to those people?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes total sense. And I will say, if maybe turnabout is fair play, right? As far as I can tell, my computer is full of Chinese parts. So,
yeah.
All right. Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a quick two-finger on that. Yeah, you have a Chinese Wi-Fi chip in there. But U.S. has never had industrial policy if it is not tied to national security, whereas the Europeans do that on a regular basis. And so it's a great recommendation, but the ones who are going to have the most trouble actually executing on that is us. And I know, because in this audience of academics, everyone cringes when you say, well, no, it's got to have a national security aspect, right? But the reality is that's the political reality. We live here. It's not in Europe.
Well, and we maybe, in the semiconductor space, we may be sort of developing one on the fly.
Yeah, it's different.
Tina, perspective from outside the United States. Obviously,
Sure.
Export controls sound very different if you're not in the United States, right?
Yeah, I guess I have a couple thoughts on that. The first is I thought it's interesting, Chris, your comment about losing talent, because I feel I say the same thing about Canada losing talent to the U.S. So I found that a little bit amusing, if I have to admit. Yeah, in terms of export controls and whether we're keeping our technology close or fostering this international collaboration, everyone knows this is difficult, right? In the context of national security, which we obviously cannot ignore. I think in these early stages, I guess, I don't know if you call it that, but I'm going to call it that, early stages, we should be looking towards collaboration. I feel like the more we move towards this idea of a quantum race, which other people have mentioned already is a sort of a harmful or not very helpful concept, and I fully agree with that. I think as we move away from that, we should be, sorry, where was I going with this? We should really be thinking about collaboration first, because if we focus too much on like our national perspectives and really keeping things close, I think it's going to be harder and harder to move away from that. So if we focus too much on keeping things, national and, having really hard export controls and keeping those, then it might be harder, in the next decade or two when maybe if tensions ease, for us to open up those relationships again. And so I think the point about, having flexible export controls where we lift them when we need to, so use them when we need to and lift them when we need to, is a very important point in that respect.
Great. Aubrey, so I want to try to envision what the market structure of this looks like. You want to jump in on this first?
I would actually like to comment on this. It's fantastic points that everyone has made. I had the ability to be stationed while I was on active duty in Korea for 2 years, Republic of Korea for 2 years, and it was a wonderful experience. And one of the things I learned from the folks with whom we collaborated there was the history or the histrionics of how Korea became a technological power in many respects. And the development of technology in Korea specifically came from people that were working for companies in Japan. Either they were of Korean nationality and working in Japan, or they were Japanese that were coming to Korea to work extra jobs, like on the weekend, or moonlighting, if you will. The technological transfer that happened just by virtue of the people moving from place to place ended up making a lot of the collaboration almost baked in. And so although a company would really like to keep their proprietary technology, I think there's a certain amount of cross-pollination that happens as a result of folks who are just working together. So I think to your point, Tina, that let's just go ahead and just start doing that now. We know that's probably going to happen anyway, so let's go ahead and build a mechanism now where we can avoid something like a quantum race. Now, there's those who would differ with that point, saying that, hey, races help innovation. If we don't have a race to motivate everybody to work 24 hours a day or 25 hours a day, then you're not going to have innovation that's going to happen. And I'm not sure if history bears that out. And so, I think there's probably a good discussion to say, hey, look, let's just be realistic about this and take it from there. And so, I forgot what your question is. I'm sorry. No, it was something about economics. I apologize.
But I do want to sort of follow up on this. What does that cooperative framework look like, right? Because so people have talked about sort of the spin outs from defense technologies and the internet and other areas. Is this do we see this as a technology that's developing kind of like Silicon Valley, where the private sector does a bunch of things and some of them might turn out to have military applications or government applications? Or is this something that seems much more like, space or something else that we've done recently, where this is a government-led technology, and of course there's public-private cooperation and there are private companies building things, but they're doing them sort of first and foremost kind of as part of a government-funded project?
I think if we're to take history as sort of a guide, I think especially in the cyber realm, we don't have a whole lot of organic capability in the military that is able to develop cyber technology. So we have to do mechanisms like other transactional arrangements or agreements, OTA, that fall outside of the federal acquisition regulations, because that process of acquisition is so long, it's so lengthy. As a result, we have to go ahead and find ways to just innovate our way around it, literally, to get the capability onboarded. Otherwise, we'll never be able to use the technology, or it'll be so late in time that it's irrelevant, if that answers it.
Just a two-finger on that. The U.S. historically spent up to 6% of its budget, this is during the Cold War, on basically funding basic research and technology development. And at one point, the U.S. Army had the largest cyber computing contract in the entire country. However, we fell away. We're down to 2%, and what we do is we wait for the private sector to fill in the other percent. Guess what other rather large country is emulating the U.S.'s early investments? It's a big country. The other thing I want to say is that we are learning from AI. And because we have gotten interested in AI and how we apply it, we are actually investing more, and we are releasing some acquisition requirements in order to acquire AI. If quantum comes into the same level, the same perception of value in a national security way, I'm sorry, I got to emphasize that, then we are much more likely to take the lessons that we learned from releasing some of these requirements on AI and move them into the quantum environment.
Great. So I want to sort of think about how this plays out in terms of both kind of private industry market structure, but also interoperability. So we ran a conference here at Stanford in January, an interdisciplinary conference on interoperability and thinking about how you could achieve it, what the opportunities were. And one of the things that came out of that conference was a sense that it was much easier to build interoperability in at the outset of a technology than it was to graft it on afterwards. Tina, is this, we're starting out in this industry, do we have an opportunity with standard setting, with kind of rules around intellectual property to sort of create an interoperable technology that people can use? Do we want to take that opportunity, or are we better off sort of having competing proprietary structures?
Yeah, I think we do have an opportunity for interoperability, and I think it's going to happen naturally anyway in certain quantum tech areas. So I think in quantum computing and in quantum communications and networks, I mean, we've already seen in our existing computing industries, in our telecom industry, the role of things like standard essential patents and interoperability. And some of that has been, I guess, hashed out through, long litigation battles in the case of the computing industry. So in a sense, we already know the result, I would say. And so I think there is an opportunity for interoperability here, and we should work towards that rather than waiting for the litigation battles to happen later. Is there a second part to that question?
Aubrey, you want to?
Well, I see a lot of that interoperability coming, very practically from the software space. Not only are most companies producing some level of interoperable software, but there are a number of startups, if you're looking at the World Economic Forum data that Jeff was talking about earlier, that are starting in the software space to make it more collaborative, to make the computers able to talk to themselves in the cloud. And so it's exciting, what's going on in that space. So I think there's some very practical application that's going on right now to ensure that that's going to happen.
Great. All right, Chris, I want to talk about cybersecurity. You are our cybersecurity expert. So one of the sort of things if you're trying to sort of hear what's quantum computing do to the world, right? The thing you hear most often is, it breaks encryption. Right, it changes the structure of encryption, right? Maybe it changes the structure, therefore, of trade secrets or privacy law. How much of this risk is real? Is this something that that sort of technology can solve as well as cause?
Well, so he asked me in advance to comment on this, so again, I have a couple of points to make on this one. But I will say, not anytime soon. Do we have to be panicked about it? Although I understand from Dr. Weissner that we've already got quantum-resistant encryption on his company's equipment. But we don't have to worry about it anytime soon. And the mother lode is, of course, quantum supremacy, depending on how you define it. And you've heard all today, so I've cut out all those comments, on how hard it is. However, when we finally figure out, however you define it, that we are and do have quantum supremacy, and when it becomes widely distributed, then it is going to be possible to use a similar, if not the same exact, malicious attacks in the same scale that we have seen up till now, because you remember that quantum rests on this highly insecure cyber substrate to begin with. And a lot of the implementation is through AI. And quantum susceptibility is remarkably widespread. It's the same reason we haven't fully secured cyber, is we just didn't think anybody would really want to do that, or it was possible. So that includes Wi-Fi networks, your current digital certs, PKI, our lovely Windows operating system. I liked writing this down, not much. Bluetooth, near-field communications, your RFIDs, of course IoT, that means that's the rest of your house. and your hardware. And why? Because, again, the basic encryption was cheap and easy to put in. There are, however, quantum-resistant technologies out there. Thank you, Dr. Weiser. But they're also, what do they really do for you? What they do is they don't make it secured. They simply double the workload. And it makes it so hard to actually use the quantum in a reasonable amount of time that you move, like all adversaries, you move on to a different target. NIST and NSA have already recommended quantum-resistant option, moving, for example, to AES 256. And one of the things it'd be interesting to think about is that you could think about designing your computational tools in advance with updates that disperse your cryptographic solutions that are, in a sense, what we talk about in cyber already, self-healing. So that when an attack is successful at whatever encryption in cryptological solution you already have, that you have a way to update them, right? The important question, given that lovely list I gave you, was who's going to pay for it? And what generally happens is we all run to some sort of service that provides it for us, and then the adversaries run to the service and they attack the service. So this game is going to go on for quite some time. And what I look forward to, again, are quantized 0 days. And that is going to be a really hard place to be if we don't start looking at this as integrated systems. The quantum technology is going to fit in to the systems we have today, and we haven't figured out how to fully secure them. And that is simply going to be one thing that's also basically infected by the problems from the substrate as well. So it's a rough road ahead, but it's not soon. Your technology, not soon.
Chris and then Tina.
I definitely agree with Chris Jemczak. It's not soon. And I have an article decomposing this problem with Simpson Garfinkel. It's in Lawfare. And I want to amplify one point you made. Only some technology is vulnerable to quantum cryptanalysis. Some is not. Some is invulnerable, which is good news. But even those forms of encryption that are vulnerable, it takes time to attack. And so the leading paper now on this is by Google. They claim with a very large machine, one of these million qubit machines discussed earlier, it would be 8 hours per key. Now this leads to some very interesting operational issues, and are important to point out. One is you cannot attack that key unless you can collect it. So there's a lot of people out there are saying quantum computers, poof, encryption is dead. No, actually, you got to be able to intercept someone's key. So I want to loop back to why that's important in a second. And then the other issue becomes key value. Some keys are just more valuable than others. And there's a lot of keys, right? So Chris, you pointed out some really important ones, the certificates, right? That's a Microsoft's software certificate is going to be the most valuable key in the world. So they'll have to operationally come up with some steps to secure it. If I can return to the collect issue, you can't attack things that you haven't collected. So then you have to think through the threat model. Who's likely to have quantum computing, and how are they a threat with respect to data that they can collect about you? So, I mean, this is like an uncomfortable observation, but let's say it's Google. Let's say Google does it, okay? And no offense to IBM. IBM, I think, is understated in this field, okay? They've got a lot of awesome stuff going on, but let's just say, well, so Google has your email. Will they use quantum cryptanalysis against your email? And I think the answer is no. It would be commercial suicide. They'd be sued out of, that would be the end. So you have to think about the threat model of who can collect, and then who has the resources to attack. And for some time, that's going to be a very small number of entities.
Tina?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a bit to Professor Demchak's comments in terms of, should we be concerned? And I would agree that we don't need to be too concerned, but at the same time, I think it's easy to get a false sense of security when we focus so much on these statistics of like how likely it is that we can break RSA encryption, all of these, and people focus a lot on that, which is okay, but it can sometimes, like I said, give this false sense of security. And so, I mean, I'm an engineer first, and I like to believe in the, innovative power of engineers and scientists. And something I always remind people is that breakthrough innovations are possible. Maybe unlikely, but possible. And so we don't want to be in a position where we feel like we have time to, migrate our systems to safer encryption frameworks and so on. We should find that comfortable balance, which is difficult, as we've heard earlier today, about how soon is too soon, in terms of being prepared that things might come sooner than we expect.
As I understand, the traditional response is, as soon as the vulnerability has been discovered, that's when we start thinking about it. But Chris, you wanted to jump
just
in.
a quick point. One of the difficulties that I neglected to mention, first off, you're right, it's not everything. When we already have symmetric encryption, that one's very difficult. The Chinese, a senior Chinese scholar, name escapes me, announced that they had just solved a quantum key distribution for 10 kilometers using 114 qubits. So we have a little time ahead of us. However, what we don't have time for necessarily is the fact that there's been an enormous amount of data already collected on us, and already is in large piles. Someone's sitting as a grand poobah on them, waiting for the opportunity to apply those 114 qubits to decryption retrospectively. And depending on how old that data is, it certainly can be useful. I also want to make a final point, two final points. One is, this is a collective endeavor, but it's going to be one that is decidedly westernized, because we are the only ones that care about privacy, particularly. And so we're going to have to get together to work on this, and it is also a place where the government, private sector cooperation, and a role for government is particularly good, because the random individual will not have the awareness, the incentive, or the funds to solve some of these problems even prospectively. So this is definitely a place where government needs to play a role.
You're not telling me that we're going to change our cybersecurity recommendations back to change your passwords every 3 months, are you?
Not anymore. No.
Thank you. All right, last question from me, Chris Hufnagel. You talked about some of the sort of military applications of sensing technology. Tell me about the possible uses of this technology for law enforcement. So we've talked about the possibility of hackers who have access to data. We've talked about the possibility of government having access to data. But ubiquitous sensing seems to have a bunch of other implications in between those two models, right?
No, absolutely. I don't think these are technologies that are difficult to control. There's a group at Berkeley that is mounting a gravity sensing device on a UAV, for instance. And so just to kind of paint out how that could be problematic, there's not a lot of shielding in people's roofs. So this could be a very effective surveillance device to fly over people's homes. And then you could just imagine, what is it that you want to detect? How about assault weapons or other things? But let me back up and say, I think we all can feel a little ambivalently about these things. And for me, I think that some of these technologies I actually want the intelligence community and the military to have. But then it becomes a very different situation if they are devolved to law enforcement agencies. Because most law enforcement agencies don't have the institutional capacity, institutional capabilities to be proportionate and use discretion in their use. I'm trying to say that carefully. But there can be a kind of loss of control. And so just imagine if someone could detect heavy objects inside your home remotely from like high up. These are things that I don't think most Americans would want. The good news is, I think under Kylo, the Supreme Court has basically said that edge technologies that peer into the home require a warrant to use. Okay, but suppose the government gets a warrant. Would you still want them to do a millimeter by millimeter remote search of your house? And that's a search that could be done over and over. So one of the scenarios Simpson and I point out in our book is that those class of people who are on supervised release, probation or parole, have a lower expectation of privacy in America. So as a condition of parole, if I were a really clever law enforcement agency, I could fly my UAV over their house every day looking for contraband. And do we want that? that type of invasion, even for people who have a lower expectation of privacy.
Anyone else?
It's important to kind of keep in context too. You know, I was talking to my students just the other day about the, Fifth and Sixth Amendment and Miranda. And it struck me because Miranda came out in 1966. The Fifth and Sixth Amendment had been in the Constitution for a really long time, and it wasn't until we had a use case, essentially, where it was very, very egregious that we actually have laws that made put an imposition or placed upon the government the requirement to ensure people understood their rights and also the waiver of the rights being in the same context. So I think it's important to ask the question now before it becomes a problem, before we trip over the tripwire and have a problem later on down the line. So it's a great point.
Great. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Very interesting panel. Thank you very much. My question is for Professor, Hooch. The guy in the middle. I cannot pronounce your name. Sorry about that. I was going to ask something else, but your point about Google actually made me think about it. I think that actually Google is the bigger threat. They pioneer surveillance capitalism, so they have data about everybody. I wonder whether everybody's focusing on the government, but what about private companies that have a lot of data? Like, for example, I use Signal. I don't use WhatsApp because it is encrypted. If one day that is broken, then the government could go to Signal that they cannot do now. So I think that there is a big threat, at least, from the private companies and hasn't been explored enough. Everybody has been focused on the government, which is rightly so. But what about those private companies that have a lot of data from you and could decrypt it if quantum becomes,
I think they're an unlikely threat actor in this sense. Even surveillance capitalism aside, I think it would be it would create tremendous liability for Google if they were to levy that attack, because they promise you privacy. So they promise you privacy, and then if they later said, we're going to use our quantum computer to undo it, it would create huge amount of liability. It's also possible for the IBMs and the Amazons in the world to look at how people are using their cloud, at least now it's possible, and stop uses that are too edge. But if we get into a world of so-called blind quantum computing, where the network issues are perfected, you could have a cloud that is ignorant of uses, and that's where there could be a lot of mischief.
I would echo that.
Tina, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Tina, and then Chris. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just echo that in terms of the cloud services. I think that's definitely an area of focus because there's a lot of, vulnerability there. There's also a lot of power there, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something that needs to be carefully managed. And so I would agree with you that I think the cloud is really where there might be a more of a threat just in terms of how it's structured versus in a specific actor, private actor on its own.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that my greater concern is the concentration of data in singular hands where they may or may not care that much about what they lose or they don't lose. And that's a problem across basically the corporate entities that have come to dominate the cyber substrate.
Okay. One final question.
Thank you, Daniel. Carry me. A quick question. The big promise of the quantum is that it's fundamentally more secure, or fundamentally more, if you use it offensive, fundamentally more effective in that. And yet it's agreed that we'll probably deploy hybrid systems first. Aren't we, is it not the same as we're trying to build an aircraft carrier, and since we're missing engine, we're building in sails and oars?
I don't think it's quite that. No, but I agree with you that one of the challenges is going to be not so much where you have encrypted, but where you haven't, or where you've weakly encrypted across, and that's where looking at how it's embedded in the wider systemic structure is extraordinarily important in this field.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I'll say, right, I mean, I feel like most of our best technologies turned out to be kludged together, right? And so it strikes me as more plausible that we actually get a technology that's 90% stuff we already know and one particular application that requires something that a quantum computer would be especially useful for wedged into it, right, than it is that we sort of start from scratch and design a handheld device that's quantum.
And you have to remember that the vast majority of things, particularly in AI, in the world of AI, the services that you have and the tools that you get are often, no, I don't want to say kludged, but they're borrowed from open sources, and they're buried deeply within that service or that instrumentation. And to such an extent, they're not even really documented. And they can be highly vulnerable, and you can be using your quantum applications on that for whatever cryptographic solutions or whatever, and have no idea that you are actually quite vulnerable through those backdoors.
Okay, please join me in thanking the panel. I'm going to turn it back over to the board.
Well, folks, thank you so much. This brings the first edition of the Stanford Responsible Quantum Technology Conference to an end. Thanks for this fantastic final panel. I think we all learned a lot about quantum mechanics, about governance, intellectual property, national security, ethics, societal impact, and about the quantum AI hybrids and the novel use cases to be unleashed on the world. I found personally discussing what responsible quantum mechanics and technology amounts to in a diverse, multidisciplinary, intergenerational setting an enriching experience. And I'm really having this sense of community in the spirit of making things happen together, which is great. On the other hand, there is still so much we don't know at this early stage, but at least we are on it. Right from the start, steering things into a direction we hope to be beneficial. So I'd like to consider our combined efforts as a research agenda outlining future research priorities. I hope you made a lot of new contacts and friends today, and that you can stay with us during the reception, where you have the opportunity to interact more with the brilliant France and Daniel, who will keep showcasing their fantastic physics experiments. We also have Jin Hee, Justin, and Katie perform musical encores by Chopin, Gounod, and Schoenberg. Thanks to all the speakers, moderators, musicians, timekeepers, to Jody and Giselle helping me organize and promote the event, to Monica from Residential Dining Enterprises and team for the wonderful catering, for helping us with the podium and letting us do the sound checks. Thanks to the video team for the excellent audiovisual support, to Misha for taking pictures of the event, and I'm looking forward to those. And we will, of course, send those to you when ready. To the physics department for lending us the equipment. Thank you to Jewel for tuning the piano. It's the second one that I had tuned here at Stanford. Thanks to the music department and to Stanford Live, Bing Concert Hall, and letting us rehearse the musical interludes in Brown Music Center over there over the past months. Thanks to you, the attendees, for being such a cool and clever audience. Special thanks to Professor Mark Lemley, who has been like an intellectual father to me over the past years. Thank you for your support and for letting us be creative. As we stand on the cusp of the second quantum revolution, we face unprecedented opportunities and challenges in the field of quantum technology. We hope to see all of you back next year at the Stanford IQT Conference 2.0. Thank you so much.